Tell me, Everett, when a man looks at another woman as though the years between them never happened, what is his wife supposed to understand? Audrey Langford's voice was scarcely louder than the autumn rain against the windows of Wycliffe Abbey, yet the question seemed to silence the entire great hall. Moments earlier, the evening had been ordinary by the restrained standards of the Langford household. Candlelight trembled across grey stone walls and dark oak paneling while a dozen guests gathered near the fireplace, their conversation softened by the wind sweeping inland from the North Sea. Audrey stood beside a silver tea service, composed in an ivory gown, performing with effortless dignity the role she had perfected during 6 years as Duchess of Langford. Then carriage wheels sounded beyond the courtyard. No guest was expected this late. Mrs. Holloway appeared beneath the archway, her usually unshakable expression altered by something Audrey could not name. Lady Rosalie Mercer, Your Grace. The name meant nothing to Audrey. Not at first. A woman entered behind the housekeeper, carrying the cold of the night with her. Rosalie Mercer was perhaps 35, pale from travel, with chestnut hair pinned beneath a dark blue bonnet and a face possessing none of the calculated beauty Audrey had learned to distrust in fashionable drawing rooms. She looked tired, human, almost frightened. Then Everett entered from the library. Audrey turned toward her husband automatically, expecting the same reserved expression he wore for nearly everyone. Instead, he stopped. The glass in his hand remained suspended halfway toward his lips. His shoulders went rigid. And for one impossible second, Duke Everett Langford forgot that anyone else existed. Rosalie. One word. Nothing more. Yet Audrey felt 6 years rearrange themselves around it. She had heard Everett speak at funerals without losing his composure. She had watched him receive news of failed harvests and ruined investments with a calmness that bordered on severity. She knew every variation of his silence. But she had never heard his voice break around a woman's name. Rosalie's gloved fingers tightened around the handle of her traveling case. Everett. No title. No Your Grace. Just Everett. Something cold moved through Audrey, though the great hall remained warm. Suddenly she remembered the locked box in his study. The old volume of poetry marked with a single letter R. The October afternoons when he rode alone toward the cliffs and returned after dark. The melody he once asked her never to play again. Small mysteries she had spent years teaching herself not to question now gathered into one terrible, elegant answer. Audrey looked at her husband. Not at Rosalie. At him. And there it was. Grief. Recognition. Wonder. A tenderness so naked that Everett himself seemed unaware he had revealed it. Audrey had waited 6 years for even a shadow of that expression. 6 years of dinners growing cold beneath silver covers. 6 years of hearing his footsteps pass her door. 6 years of telling herself that some men simply loved quietly, that duty might one day soften into affection, that patience was not the same thing as loneliness. How foolish hope could look when illuminated all at once. Everett finally seemed to remember the room. His eyes found Audrey's. Audrey, I can explain. She almost smiled. Explain. The word arrived years too late. Around them, the guests had discovered sudden fascination with their teacups and the fire. Audrey lowered her gaze to her left hand. The gold band looked exactly as it had that morning. Strange that an object could remain unchanged while everything it represented became uncertain. She touched it with her thumb. Everett took one step toward her. Audrey. This time there was warning in his voice. Or fear. Perhaps she had never learned the difference. She slowly drew the ring from her finger. No anger. No spectacle. Only the faintest sound as she placed it on the polished table beside a burning candle. Everett stared at it. Rosalie went pale. Audrey lifted her chin, and when she spoke, her voice carried the quiet dignity of a woman who had finally stopped asking herself why she had never been enough. Now I understand. Everett's face changed. Understand what? Audrey looked at the man she had called her husband for 6 years, then at the ring glowing between them in the candlelight. That I have spent far too long searching for something wrong with me. The wind struck the ancient windows. Audrey met his eyes once more. There was nothing wrong with me, Everett. There was simply someone here before me. Then she turned and walked from the great hall, leaving the Duke motionless beside the ring he had once placed upon her hand. 6 years earlier, Audrey Caldwell had arrived at Wycliffe Abbey beneath a sky the color of tarnished silver, carrying 2 trunks, a collection of well-worn books, and the quiet hope that affection might grow where love had not yet taken root. The carriage climbed the final mile through windswept fields before the old abbey appeared above the Northumberland cliffs, its grey towers rising against the restless North Sea. Audrey remembered pressing one gloved hand against the window, and wondering whether a house could look lonely. Wycliffe could. Everett Langford waited beneath the stone archway when the carriage stopped. At 32, the Duke already possessed the controlled manner of a man accustomed to having every emotion obey him. He was tall, dark-haired, impeccably dressed, and courteous enough that Audrey immediately understood why society could find nothing substantial to criticize about him. "Welcome to Wycliffe," he said, offering his hand. "Not welcome home." She noticed the distinction, then disliked herself for noticing it. Their marriage had been arranged with practical expectations on both sides. The Caldwell family possessed respectable connections but little remaining fortune. Everett possessed land, wealth, and an old title that carried obligations heavier than either. Audrey had known there would be no declaration of devotion waiting for her at the altar. Still, she had believed kindness might become friendship, friendship might become tenderness, and tenderness, given enough years, might become something neither of them had expected. During her first evening at Wycliffe, Everett showed her the principal rooms himself. The library faced east. The dining room overlooked the inner courtyard. Beyond the western corridor stood a small chapel where generations of Langfords had married, mourned, and prayed. "You may change anything you wish," Everett told her. Audrey glanced toward the faded tapestries and arrangements of flowers long past their best. "Anything?" For the first time, something almost resembling amusement touched his eyes. "Within reason." She smiled. "Then I shall endeavor to remain reasonable." He looked at her for one heartbeat longer than necessary, and that tiny hesitation became the first hope she treasured. It would not be the last. Everett was never cruel. Cruelty would have been easier to name. He remembered her birthday. He ensured she had horses for riding and money for every household expense. When winter arrived, he ordered additional coal for her rooms because he had once noticed her warming her hands near the library fire. At dinner he asked whether she had enjoyed her day, and he listened politely to the answer. But politeness had walls. Audrey discovered them slowly. Everett never spoke about his youth. He never mentioned why certain songs made his expression close. He never explained why he sometimes stood at the windows overlooking the sea as though waiting for a ship that had disappeared years ago. Whenever Audrey approached those invisible boundaries, he retreated behind impeccable courtesy. On the night marking their first month of marriage, she asked whether he would walk with her through the courtyard after dinner. The rain had stopped, and moonlight silvered the wet stones. Everett looked toward the papers beside his plate. "I have correspondence requiring my attention." "Of course." Audrey smiled because smiling preserved dignity where disappointment threatened it. "Another evening, perhaps?" "Certainly." Another evening did not come. Yet Audrey continued trying. She placed fresh flowers in his study. She learned that he preferred strong coffee before riding in the morning and tea after returning. She discovered which books made him linger beside the library shelves and ordered new editions from London. Once, when he returned from a 3-day journey, he found the eastern fireplace restored after years of disuse. "You remembered I said this room was cold," he observed. Audrey looked up from her embroidery. "I remember most things you tell me." Everett became very still. For one fleeting moment, she thought he might say something that mattered. Instead, he answered softly, "You are very thoughtful." That night Audrey lay awake listening to the wind move through the ancient corridors. Shortly after midnight, footsteps approached her door. They slowed. Stopped. Her heart lifted before she could prevent it. She waited. Seconds passed. Then the footsteps continued down the corridor. Audrey stared into the darkness, telling herself there would be other nights, other winters, other chances. She did not yet understand that loneliness was not always the absence of another person. Sometimes it was sharing a home with someone who gave you everything except the one thing you were waiting for. By the end of Audrey's first year at Wycliffe Abbey, she had begun to understand that every old house kept its secrets differently. Some concealed them behind locked doors. Others buried them beneath dust, portraits, and forgotten furniture. Wycliffe seemed to hide its greatest secret in plain sight, scattered through ordinary rooms in fragments so small that Audrey might never have noticed them had she not loved the man who refused to explain them. The first fragment appeared in the music room one rainy afternoon. Audrey had been sorting through neglected sheets of music when she discovered a handwritten arrangement tucked beneath several yellowed compositions. The melody was beautiful, melancholy without being mournful, and she carried it to the piano. She had played fewer than 20 measures when Everett appeared in the doorway. "Please stop." Audrey's hands froze above the keys. She turned. His face had lost its usual calm. "I am sorry. I did not realize you were working nearby." "I was not." His gaze settled upon the music. Something tightened behind his eyes. "I would prefer that piece not be played again." Audrey looked down at the faded page. Of course. She expected an explanation. None came. Everett crossed the room, lifted the sheet carefully, and placed it inside a cabinet. He handled the paper with a tenderness Audrey had never seen him show anything else. Then he locked the cabinet and left. The second fragment appeared months later in the library. Audrey was searching for a volume of poetry when an older book slipped from the shelf. A dried white rose fell from between its pages. On the inside cover, written in a graceful feminine hand, were 4 words, "For E, always are." Audrey stared at the inscription until the letters seemed to deepen against the paper. She returned the rose exactly where she had found it. That evening, she nearly asked Everett about it. He sat across from her at dinner beneath the amber glow of candles, reading correspondence between courses. "Everett?" He looked up. "Yes?" Audrey studied his face. The question reached her lips and died there. "Nothing. I was only wondering whether you wanted more tea." "Thank you." He returned to his letters. Audrey poured the tea. The third fragment was not an object at all, but a date. Every year, on October 14th, Everett disappeared toward the cliffs before breakfast. He rode alone for nearly 4 miles to an old stone bench overlooking the sea and did not return until dusk. No business was scheduled on that day. No visitors were received. Mrs. Holloway quietly instructed the servants never to disturb him. During Audrey's second autumn at Wycliffe, curiosity overcame her caution. "What happened on October 14th?" she asked the housekeeper. Mrs. Holloway stopped arranging flowers. For several seconds, only the clock answered. "That is a question His Grace must answer himself." Audrey understood the warning beneath the kindness and never asked again. But the fragments continued. A small silver box remained locked inside Everett's desk. A packet of letters disappeared whenever Audrey entered unexpectedly. Once, while standing beside him at the chapel window, she noticed his gaze fixed upon a ship far beyond the cliffs. "Do you ever wish you had left England?" she asked. Everett's expression changed so subtly another person might have missed it. Audrey did not. "Once," he said. "A long time ago." "What stopped you?" The wind pressed softly against the old glass. "Duty." One word. The same force that had brought Audrey into his life. That realization followed her back through the corridor like a shadow. By their 3rd year of marriage, Audrey had assembled enough pieces to recognize the shape of an absence. There had been someone before her. Someone connected to music, white roses, old poetry, October 14th, and perhaps even the distant ships Everett watched from the cliffs. Yet Audrey knew neither her name nor why she had vanished. She only knew that the woman had left behind no portrait, no jewelry displayed in a cabinet, no obvious memorial. Nothing that society could point toward and call improper. And somehow that made her presence stronger. Audrey could not compete with a woman she could not see. Worse, she did not want to compete. Love begged for was merely pity wearing a kinder face. So she stopped asking silent questions. She stopped searching Everett's expressions for answers he had never promised to give. But sometimes, late in the evening, Audrey would pass the library and see him standing alone beside the eastern window, an old book open in his hands. She would continue walking without disturbing him. And Everett, hearing her footsteps fade down the corridor, would close the book over the dried white rose and remain in the darkness, never realizing that his wife already knew she was sharing her marriage with a memory. By the 4th year of their marriage, Audrey had stopped measuring happiness by the distance between Everett's footsteps and her bedroom door. The change happened so quietly that even she could not have named the exact evening when hope became habit and habit became resignation. There was no argument, no cruel confession, no single wound dramatic enough to explain the silence that settled between them. There were simply hundreds of small disappointments, each too insignificant to protest and too persistent to forget. Audrey had once waited for Everett at dinner whenever estate business kept him late. At first, she would sit beneath the chandelier with 2 places set before the fire, listening for horses in the courtyard. At 9 o'clock, Mrs. Holloway would appear with concern carefully hidden behind professional composure. "Perhaps your Grace should eat." Audrey always answered the same way. Another 15 minutes. Sometimes 15 became 30. Sometimes the candles shortened by several inches before Everett returned, entered the dining room with rain on his coat, and stopped when he saw her waiting. "You should not have delayed dinner for me." "Never, I am glad you waited." "Never, I miss you." Only practical concern. Eventually Audrey began eating at 8. The second place remained set for several months. Then one evening she quietly asked the footman to remove it. Everett did not notice. She stopped sending books to his study after discovering 3 unopened volumes exactly where she had left them. She stopped arranging flowers on his desk after hearing him tell Thomas Bell that the fragrance distracted him from correspondence. She stopped asking whether he would accompany her through the gardens. She stopped leaving the lamp burning near her door. Each surrender was almost painless by itself. Together, they became the architecture of her marriage. Everett noticed none of it because Audrey never punished him with anger. She remained gracious at breakfast. She stood beside him when neighboring families visited. She remembered every tenant's name and every obligation attached to the Langford estate. At public dinners, they appeared perfectly matched, the reserved Duke and his elegant Duchess, speaking with the effortless understanding expected of a couple long accustomed to one another. Guests sometimes remarked upon their peaceful marriage. Audrey learned to smile at that. Peace, she discovered, could resemble emptiness when viewed from a distance. Yet there were moments that made surrender difficult. One December evening, Everett returned from Newcastle during a snowstorm after Audrey had spent 2 days ill with a winter fever. He came directly to her sitting room, still wearing his traveling coat. "Why was I not informed?" His voice carried an urgency she had never heard directed toward her. Audrey looked up from the chair beside the fire. "There was nothing to inform you about. I am recovering. The physician came twice. Mrs. Holloway worries." Everett crossed the room and touched the back of his fingers briefly to Audrey's forehead. The gesture was simple, almost formal, but her heart betrayed her with immediate hope. "You are still warm. I shall survive." That was not amusing. She looked at him then. Really looked. His eyes held concern. For several dangerous seconds, Audrey imagined what life might have been if he always looked at her that way. Everett seemed about to say something. Instead, he withdrew his hand. "You should rest." By morning he had returned to his study. Audrey hated herself for mourning the loss of a tenderness that had lasted less than a minute. That spring, she made a decision. If Everett's heart contained a room whose door would never open for her, she would stop standing outside it. She began spending her mornings with Thomas Bell reviewing estate accounts. In the afternoons, she visited cottages beyond the southern fields and learned which roofs leaked, which families needed coal, which children walked nearly 3 miles for lessons. She reopened the abandoned greenhouse overlooking the sea and ordered the cracked panes replaced. Slowly, Wycliffe became larger than her marriage. There were people who needed her without being asked to. There was work that answered effort with visible change. Everett noticed only that Audrey no longer waited for him. At first, he told himself this was what he had wanted. Independence suited them both. Then one evening he returned earlier than expected and found her chair beside the library fire empty. He stood there for several seconds, staring at the place where she had once sat with embroidery in her lap, while he read correspondence. "Where is Her Grace?" he asked Mrs. Holloway. "At the village school, Your Grace." Everett glanced toward the dark windows. "At this hour?" Mrs. Holloway's expression remained perfectly respectful. "The Duchess has kept rather busy these past months." Everett said nothing. But later, alone at dinner, he looked across the long table at the empty chair opposite him and experienced an unfamiliar discomfort. Audrey had finally learned how to live without waiting for her husband. Everett had not yet understood that he was beginning to notice the absence of a wife who was still living beneath his roof. The greenhouse became the first place at Wycliffe Abbey that seemed entirely Audrey's own. By early summer, sunlight poured through newly replaced panes of glass, warming rows of lavender, rosemary, white roses, and young citrus trees that had once seemed impossible to grow so close to the cold North Sea. Audrey spent hours there with her sleeves neatly turned at the wrists, discussing planting schedules with the gardener or reviewing estate accounts at a small wooden table near the southern wall. What had begun as a refuge gradually became something larger. The tenants came to her with problems they had once carried directly to Thomas Bell. A leaking roof. A failed crop. A child clever enough for schooling but born too far from the village classroom. Audrey listened. More importantly, she remembered. When she discovered that 12 children were walking nearly 3 miles each morning for lessons, she converted an unused building near the southern cottages into a schoolroom. When several families struggled through an unusually wet harvest, she reorganized grain reserves so no household would face winter without enough food. When an elderly tenant could no longer maintain his cottage, Audrey quietly arranged repairs and instructed Thomas never to mention who had paid for them. "People dislike feeling indebted," she explained. "Help should preserve dignity whenever possible." Everett heard about these things indirectly. At breakfast, Thomas would say, "Her Grace has already resolved the matter." During meetings, the steward would mention. The Duchess suggested another approach. In the village, men removed their hats when Audrey passed, while mothers called children from doorways to greet her. Everett had always been respected in Northumberland. Audrey was loved. The distinction unsettled him more than he wished to admit. One afternoon, returning from inspecting the northern boundary, he saw Audrey beside the schoolhouse surrounded by children. A little girl held up a crooked drawing while Audrey examined it with the seriousness she might have given an important document. Then she laughed. Everett pulled gently on the reins and stopped his horse nearly 50 yards away. He could not remember the last time he had heard that sound inside Wycliffe. Perhaps he had never truly listened for it. That evening, Audrey entered the dining room several minutes late. "Forgive me," she said, taking her seat. "One of the school windows would not close properly." "You were repairing windows?" Everett asked. "I was supervising someone more qualified." A faint smile touched her mouth. Everett almost smiled in return. "Thomas tells me enrollment has doubled." "Nearly. And the southern cottages have new roofs." Audrey glanced at him. 3 of them needed repairs before autumn. "You have been busy." Once those words might have thrilled her. Now she simply unfolded her napkin. "There is much to do." Everett watched her through dinner with a curiosity that felt strangely new. He noticed she no longer searched his face after speaking. She no longer filled silences simply because they made her uncomfortable. Somewhere during the years he had spent protecting the private chambers of his memory, Audrey had become a woman whose life no longer revolved around gaining entrance to them. Several weeks later, Everett entered the greenhouse for the first time since its restoration. Warm air carried the scent of damp earth and roses. He found Audrey kneeling beside a row of white blossoms, tying a young stem carefully to a wooden support. "I did not know these survived," he said. Audrey looked over her shoulder. "The old plants did not. These came from a nursery near York." Everett approached one of the roses and touched a petal with unexpected gentleness. "My mother grew this variety." Audrey returned to the plant before her. "I know." His hand stopped. "How? You mentioned it once." Everett searched his memory. "When?" "Our first winter." He stared at her. 5 years had passed since then. He barely remembered the conversation, yet she had carried one careless sentence across half a decade. "You remembered." Audrey tied the ribbon around the stem. "I told you once that I remember most things you say." The words struck him with uncomfortable familiarity. He had heard them years earlier and failed to understand their value. Now, standing inside a garden created by the woman he had neglected to know, Everett suddenly saw evidence of her everywhere. Not grand declarations. Not demands. Small acts repeated until they had transformed an estate. That autumn, illness spread through several villages along the coast. Nothing severe for most families, but enough to keep workers home and leave elderly tenants isolated. Audrey organized deliveries of soup, coal, blankets, and medicine. She spent long days coordinating servants and volunteers, returning to Wycliffe after sunset with exhaustion hidden beneath composure. Everett began waiting for the sound of her carriage. He told himself it was concern. Duty. Nothing more. Then one rainy evening she was nearly 2 hours later than expected. Everett stood at the great hall window watching the road disappear into darkness. When carriage lamps finally appeared beyond the gates, relief moved through him so sharply that he stepped away from the glass as though embarrassed to have felt it. Audrey entered moments later, rain glistening on her cloak. "You are awake," she said, surprised. Everett looked at her, suddenly unable to explain why he had been waiting. "It appears so." Audrey smiled faintly and continued upstairs. Everett remained beneath the candlelight, listening until her footsteps disappeared. For years, Audrey had waited for him to come home. Neither of them yet understood that, without intention or permission, Everett had finally begun waiting for her. The letter arrived on an October morning when the sea beyond Wycliffe Abbey was almost invisible beneath a veil of silver mist. Audrey was in the breakfast room reviewing school expenses with Thomas Bell when Mrs. Holloway entered carrying a cream envelope upon a silver tray. "For His Grace," she said. Everett glanced at the handwriting, and the coffee cup in his hand stopped before reaching his lips. It was only a moment. Audrey might once have missed it. She did not miss such things anymore. "Thank you," Everett said. Mrs. Holloway withdrew. Thomas continued discussing the cost of repairing the schoolhouse chimney, but Audrey noticed Everett slide the unopened letter beneath his newspaper. He did not read it until she left the room. An hour later, Everett stood alone in the library with the envelope open before him. The message contained fewer than 100 words. Lady Rosalie Mercer had returned to England after 11 years in America. Her husband had died nearly 2 years earlier. She was staying temporarily with relatives in Edinburgh and wished to speak with Everett regarding a matter that should have been settled long ago. At the bottom was one sentence that made the room seem suddenly smaller. She possessed a letter he had never received. Everett read those words 3 times. Then he crossed to the eastern window. 11 years vanished with frightening ease. He remembered a younger Rosalie beneath summer trees, white roses pinned at her collar. He remembered promises made before duty became stronger than desire. Most of all, he remembered October 14th, the day he had waited for a message that never came. Rosalie had been expected to meet him before leaving England. Instead, there had been silence. Within weeks, she was gone. Months later came news that she had married an American businessman in Boston. Everett had accepted what pride demanded he accept. She had chosen another life. He had buried the question without burying the woman attached to it. Now a letter waited in his hand, asking him to disturb the grave of something he had spent 11 years preserving. That afternoon, Audrey found him in the greenhouse. He rarely entered without reason, Yet there he stood among the white roses, staring toward the sea through rain-streaked glass. "Everett?" He turned. Audrey noticed the letter immediately. "Has something happened? Someone I knew years ago has returned to England." His voice was controlled, but control no longer deceived her. "I see." Everett looked at the envelope. "Lady Rosalie Mercer." The name meant nothing to Audrey, but something inside her became very still. "Was she a friend?" A pause followed. "Too long." "Yes." Audrey lowered her eyes to the ledger on the table. She could have asked more. Years earlier she would have. Instead she said, "Then I hope her return brings whatever piece was missing from her absence." Everett stared at her. There was no accusation in the words. Somehow that made them harder to hear. 3 days later, Rosalie wrote again. She would be traveling south and asked permission to stop at Wycliffe. Everett agreed. He told himself refusing would be cowardice. He told himself the past deserved a final answer. He did not ask himself why he kept the second letter inside his coat throughout the day. Rosalie arrived near sunset beneath a sky dark with approaching rain. Her carriage crossed the courtyard as Audrey supervised preparations for several neighboring families invited to dinner. When Mrs. Holloway announced a visitor, Everett was still in the library. Audrey went to receive her alone. Lady Rosalie Mercer stepped into the great hall wearing a dark blue traveling dress. She was graceful without display, and sorrow had softened rather than hardened her face. Audrey had expected, without admitting it, to dislike her. Instead, she saw a tired woman standing uncertainly in a house filled with memories. "Your Grace," Rosalie said. "Thank you for allowing me to come. You are welcome at Wycliffe." Audrey's answer was sincere. That sincerity frightened her. Then Everett entered. Rosalie turned. Neither moved. Audrey watched 11 years cross the space between them without a single word. Everett's face changed first. The reserve Audrey had spent 6 years trying to understand simply disappeared. "Rosalie." Her name left him like something remembered in sleep. Rosalie's eyes shone with emotion she quickly mastered. "Everett." Audrey felt the room tilt, though nothing had moved. Later, in the library, Rosalie removed an old envelope from her traveling case. "My father intercepted this before I left England," she said. "I discovered it among his papers after his death." Everett recognized his own name written in her younger hand. "What does it say?" Rosalie looked at him sadly. "That I waited for you on October 14th. That I did not choose to leave without you." Everett closed his eyes. Outside, rain began striking the windows. In the corridor beyond the half-open door, Audrey had approached to tell them dinner was ready. She stopped when she heard the date. October 14th. The stone bench. The solitary rides. The white roses. At last, the invisible woman had a name. Audrey quietly stepped away before either of them knew she had been there, carrying with her the terrible knowledge that the ghost inside her marriage had never been a ghost at all. Audrey did not return to the library. She walked instead through the western corridor toward the old chapel, where the last grey light of evening rested against the narrow Gothic windows. For 6 years she had imagined 100 explanations for Everett's distance. She had blamed temperament, duty, grief, even herself. Never once had she allowed the simplest answer to become fully real. There had been another woman, and Everett had not merely remembered her. He had waited for her. Audrey stood before the chapel window and watched rain blur the sea beyond the cliffs. October 14th. Suddenly every year of her marriage seemed to contain that date. While she had been learning how Everett preferred his coffee, he had remembered Rosalie. While she restored his mother's roses, he had ridden alone to the place where another woman had once promised to meet him. Audrey pressed her fingers together until the trembling stopped. She would not cry here. Not because tears were shameful, but because she had already given this marriage too many private tears. By dinner, her composure had returned. The neighboring guests arrived despite the weather, filling the great hall with candlelight and restrained laughter. Audrey received them exactly as she always had. She introduced Rosalie without hesitation. She discussed the village school with Mrs. Harcourt, and listened patiently while Sir William complained about the coastal road. No one could have guessed that something inside the Duchess had quietly reached its end. Everett could. He watched Audrey from across the room with increasing unease. She was gracious, attentive, almost serene. Yet she did not look toward him unless courtesy required it. Once, Rosalie touched Everett's sleeve while answering a question about Boston, and Audrey's gaze happened to fall upon them. Everett immediately stepped back. The movement came too late. Audrey had already seen something more painful than the touch itself. She had seen his face when Rosalie first entered Wycliffe. That expression could not be explained away by distance or manners. After dinner, rain struck harder against the tall windows. Several guests gathered near the fireplace while Rosalie stood beside an old cabinet examining a silver pocket watch Everett had taken from it. "You kept it," she said softly. Everett looked at the watch in her hands. "I forgot it was there." Rosalie gave him a sad smile. "No, you did not." Audrey heard the words from several feet away. Everett turned and found his wife watching him. The room seemed to narrow between them. "Audrey," he said. She crossed toward him slowly. Conversations faded, not because she demanded attention, but because something in her stillness made people instinctively quiet. Everett's gaze dropped to her hand as Audrey touched the gold band on her finger. "There is something I should have told you years ago," he said. "Yes." Her answer was gentle. "There is. Rosalie and I were once expected to marry." A silence followed. "I gathered as much." Everett's expression tightened. "It was over before you and I met." Audrey looked toward the pocket watch, then toward Rosalie, whose face held unmistakable regret. "Was it?" Everett did not answer quickly enough. Audrey felt the final thread of hope break without drama. She slowly removed her ring. Everett stared at her hand. "What are you doing?" She placed the band beside the nearest candle. The tiny sound of gold meeting polished wood seemed louder than the storm. "I spent 6 years believing there must be some quality I lacked," Audrey said. "I thought perhaps I was not interesting enough to hold your attention, not patient enough to earn your trust, not warm enough to make this house feel like a home to you. Audrey, that is not true." "I know." Her eyes lifted to his. "That is what I finally know." Everett took a step closer. "Then do not do this because of something that ended 11 years ago." Audrey's expression softened, and that softness frightened him more than anger would have. "I am not doing this because Rosalie returned." She glanced toward the woman standing silently near the cabinet. "She has done nothing wrong." Rosalie lowered her eyes. Audrey continued, "I am doing this because her return showed me something I could never make myself see while she was absent." Everett's voice dropped. "What?" Audrey looked at him for a long moment. "That I have spent 6 years trying to be chosen by a man who had already made his choice before he ever met me. You are my wife." The words came too quickly, too desperately. Audrey almost smiled. "That is a fact, Everett. It is not an answer." He went still. For once, the Duke of Langford possessed no careful sentence, no shield of courtesy, no duty behind which to retreat. Audrey looked down at the ring glowing beside the candle. "There was never anything wrong with me," she said quietly. "There was simply someone here before me." Then she turned toward the staircase. Everett did not follow. Perhaps shock held him there. Perhaps 11 years of unanswered questions still stood between him and Rosalie. Audrey did not know. She only knew that when she reached the first landing and looked back, her husband remained beside the table, staring at the ring instead of coming after her. That was the moment that hurt most. Not Rosalie's return. Not the hidden letters. Not even the years Audrey had spent waiting. It was the few seconds in which Everett could have followed his wife and did not. Audrey continued upstairs without looking back again, while below her Everett finally reached for the ring with a hand that was no longer steady. Audrey left Wycliffe Abbey 3 mornings later beneath a pale sky washed clean by the storm. She took no jewels except those that had belonged to her mother, no paintings, no silver, and none of the costly gifts Everett had given her during 6 years of marriage. 2 trunks were loaded into a modest carriage bound for a small Langford cottage overlooking the coast, nearly 5 miles south of the Abbey. Henry Caldwell, her cousin and longtime family solicitor, had agreed to meet her there and discuss what arrangements could be made without scandal or cruelty. Audrey wanted neither revenge nor humiliation. She wanted distance. Everett watched the carriage disappear from an upstairs window. He had asked her to stay. Once. The words had sounded wrong even to him. "You need not leave your own home," Audrey had answered quietly. "That is precisely why I must." He had found nothing to say after that. The ring remained in the inner pocket of his coat. He carried it everywhere without understanding why. During the first day of Audrey's absence, Wycliffe seemed unchanged. Breakfast arrived at 8. Thomas Bell brought the estate ledgers at 9. Correspondence waited in the library. The clocks continued measuring hours with merciless indifference. By the second day, Everett began noticing small failures in the machinery of his life. His afternoon tea arrived without lemon. The flowers in the library had disappeared. A tenant came asking whether the Duchess had approved repairs to a cottage roof, then looked disappointed upon learning she was away. By the 4th day, 3 letters addressed to Audrey waited on the hall table. One came from the schoolmistress. Another from a farmer's wife. The third had been written in the uncertain hand of a child. Everett did not open them. He simply stared at his wife's name, and realized how many lives within 10 miles of Wycliffe had quietly arranged themselves around her kindness. Rosalie found him in the greenhouse that afternoon. He stood among the white roses Audrey had planted, one hand resting against the wooden table where her ledgers still remained stacked in careful order. "You love her," Rosalie said. Everett did not turn. Do not what? Reduce this to something simple." Rosalie approached slowly. "I am not reducing anything. You are the one who spent years making something simple unbearably complicated." He finally faced her. 11 years earlier, the sight of Rosalie would have unsettled every certainty he possessed. Now he looked at her and saw tenderness, regret, and the remains of a life that might once have been his. But he did not see home. That realization frightened him. "I loved you," Everett said. Rosalie's expression softened. "Yes. I waited for you. I know. If that letter had reached me..." His voice faded. Rosalie looked toward the rain-dimmed glass. "Then perhaps everything would have been different." Everett closed his eyes briefly. "That is what I cannot forgive." "Whom?" she asked. "Your father? Fate? Me?" He said nothing. Rosalie's gaze moved around the greenhouse. "Audrey remembered your mother's roses." Everett looked at the white blossoms. "I mentioned them once. And you remembered the date I failed to meet you for 11 years. The truth settled between them." Rosalie continued gently. "You built a shrine to what we lost, Everett. Audrey built a life around what remained." He turned away. "You do not know my marriage." "No. But I know the way you watched the door after she left the great hall." Everett's jaw tightened. "I should have followed her." "Yes." There was no judgment in Rosalie's answer. That made it worse. Everett reached into his coat and opened his hand. Audrey's ring rested against his palm. Rosalie looked at it for several seconds. "Why are you carrying that?" "I do not know." "You do." Everett closed his fingers around the gold band. For years he had believed loyalty to his first love proved the depth of his heart. Now he began to understand that memory had required nothing from him. Memory could not disappoint him, challenge him, or ask to be seen. Audrey had been real. She had stood beside him through ordinary mornings and difficult winters. She had transformed Wycliffe, while he remained faithful to an absence. That evening, Everett walked through the Abbey alone. In the dining room, he saw the chair where Audrey had once waited past 9 o'clock. In the library, he noticed the restored fireplace she had arranged during their first winter. Near the eastern window stood a reading lamp she had chosen because he complained that the old one strained his eyes. Everywhere he looked, Audrey existed through acts so quiet he had mistaken them for the natural order of things. He entered the greenhouse after midnight and stood among the roses. Rosalie's words returned to him. "You love her." This time he did not resist them. "Audrey," he whispered into the empty room. Her name did not feel like memory. It felt like loss. By sunrise, Everett had made a decision. He would go to the cottage. Not as the Duke of Langford demanding his wife return. Not with explanations designed to make 6 wasted years disappear. He would take her ring and tell her the one truth he should have discovered long before Rosalie returned. Audrey had been right to stop waiting. Now, if there was to be any hope left between them, Everett would have to learn how to wait for her. Everett reached the cottage shortly after sunrise, having ridden the 5 miles from Wycliffe beneath the sky slowly clearing over the North Sea. He had imagined a dozen speeches during the journey, each carefully reasoned, each utterly useless by the time Audrey opened the door. She wore a simple gray morning dress, her hair loosely pinned, and for the first time in 6 years he saw her somewhere that did not belong to him. The realization stripped away the last comfort of his title. "Everett." Her voice was calm. "Audrey." Neither moved. Behind her, a small fire warmed the sitting room, and through the windows the sea shone beneath the first pale light of morning. "Henry is not here," she said. "He has gone into the village. I did not come to speak with Henry." Audrey hesitated, then stepped aside. Everett entered but remained near the door. He did not remove his coat. He did not behave as though he intended to stay. That mattered to her more than she wished it did. "I owe you an apology," he said. "More than one." Audrey folded her hands. "An apology will not restore 6 years." "I know." The absence of defense surprised her. Everett reached into his coat and placed her wedding ring on the small table between them. Audrey stared at it but made no attempt to touch it. "I am not asking you to put it on." His voice was quieter now. "And I will not put it on your hand. I forfeited the right to decide what that ring means to you." Audrey looked up. "Then why bring it?" Everett considered the question. "Because I finally understand what I did." He moved toward the window, stopping several feet from her. "I believe that because I was never cruel to you, I had been a decent husband. I gave you security, respect, freedom, everything I thought duty required." His mouth tightened with regret. "Everything except myself." Audrey said nothing. "Rosalie was the life I lost," he continued. "For 11 years I preserved that loss because it was easier than questioning it. A memory asks nothing of a man. It cannot change. It cannot disappoint him. It cannot ask him to become better." His gaze returned to Audrey. "You did." Something flickered across her face. Everett continued before courage abandoned him. "You remembered my mother's roses. You restored rooms I had stopped seeing. You cared for people whose names I should have known. You waited for me until waiting became too painful, and when you finally stopped, I was arrogant enough to notice only that the house felt different." Audrey looked toward the sea. "You noticed because Rosalie returned." "No." Everett's answer came immediately. "Rosalie's return forced me to understand what I had already begun to feel." Audrey faced him again. "And what was that?" For once, Everett did not hide behind careful language. "That I had fallen in love with my wife while behaving as though loving her would betray a woman who existed only in my past." The room became very quiet. Audrey's eyes glistened, but her voice remained steady. "You cannot say those words and expect me to forget everything. I do not. I cannot return to Wycliffe today. I know. I may not return next week." Everett nodded. "Then I will wait." Audrey almost laughed, though sadness softened the sound. "You have never been particularly good at waiting for me." "No," he said. "But I would like to learn." She looked at the ring between them. "And Rosalie?" Everett's expression held affection, but no uncertainty. "She was someone I loved deeply. I will not insult what we were by pretending otherwise. He paused. But she is not the woman whose absence has made every room in Wycliffe feel empty. Audrey lowered her gaze. What are you asking for? Nothing you are not willing to give. He stepped toward the door. If you permit it, I would like to visit tomorrow. We could walk along the cliffs. You could tell me about the school, and this time I will listen properly. Audrey studied him for a long moment. 10 o'clock. Everett released a breath. 10 o'clock. He left the ring on the table. For the next several months, the Duke of Langford courted his own wife. He came without servants whenever he could. They walked beside the sea, visited the school, argued over estate improvements, and gradually spoke about all the things 6 years of politeness had buried. Some days Audrey trusted him. Some days she did not. Everett learned not to demand progress simply because he desired forgiveness. Winter softened into spring. White roses bloomed again inside the Wycliffe greenhouse. On a mild April morning, Audrey returned there for the first time since leaving the Abbey. Everett found her beside the same row of roses she had planted years before. He stopped several feet away. "Welcome home," he said. Audrey looked at him, remembering another arrival long ago and the words he had spoken then. This time, home sounded different. She reached into her pocket and revealed the gold ring. Everett remained perfectly still as Audrey slipped it onto her own finger. No promise had been forced from her. No title had commanded her return. She had chosen. Audrey extended her hand, and Everett took it with a gentleness born not from fear of losing her, but from gratitude that she had allowed him to know her at last. Beyond the glass, morning sunlight spread across the North Sea, turning the water silver and gold. Wycliffe Abbey was still old, still grey, still filled with memories. But memories no longer ruled its living rooms. Some loves belonged to the life that might have been. The wiser heart learns to honor them without sacrificing the life still waiting to be lived.